Welcome to the Breakfast Leadership Show, where we interview global thought leaders on business, leadership, and life. Here's your host, keynote speaker, best-selling author, and chief burnout officer of the Breakfast Leadership Network, Michael Levitt.
Welcome back. I've got James Weiss on the line. James, how are you today?
Good. How are you, Michael?
I am awesome. Really looking forward to this conversation. So for those that aren't familiar with you yet, why don't you share a little bit about you, and then we'll jump into this conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So my name is James. I serve as the managing director of Big Drop Inc. We are a full service digital agency headquartered in Manhattan, New York, in the financial district. I've been there for over 6 years now and worked with brands in all different kinds of capacities and all different kinds of verticals. And so it's been a pleasure to kind of watch all of that growth happen with our clients, and certainly, by extension, Big Drops as well. So really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. And you're in the right neighborhood for doing that kind of work, because, when I think advertising and I think marketing and branding, New York is where it comes from.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. and has for a very, very long time. And so you're in the right neighborhood for doing that kind of work. And and the food choices aren't bad either in Manhattan.
No, of course.
It's like I'm not here long enough to try everything. Well, I could live there and I wouldn't be there long enough to try everything. So that's the beauty about there. And I got to get back to New York. It's been a little bit. So the work they did, and obviously, and this is in your bio, so it's not me just calling it out, being, a mid-50s guy, but, you're, in your early 30s, and you've had some amazing success early on in your career, which, as we were kind of joking a little bit in the pre-show, it's like, you're just getting started. So you've got a ways to go, and which means you're going to have a gigantic impact on things. So what, I always ask this question, what got you interested in this kind of work?
It's so interesting because I've said this before, but I think marketing kind of found me. I wasn't really interested in much else at the time, although just organically through different opportunities and trying to build my career in college, I fell into roles that were communications focused, marketing focused, digital focused, and that kind of set the path for where I am now. But it was really a matter of wanting to work in the music industry. That was my main goal. And a couple internships that I found with, a major record label and their distributor were all marketing focused. So any foot in the door I could get, that's kind of where my head was at the time. And just learning on the job training, really figuring out what made everything kind of tick from a marketing perspective. For me, I always found it to be fascinating. I think there's an intellectual curiosity that goes around marketing and communications that kind of always need to have. And if you're any marketer worth their salt, anyone who's really investing the time to do it properly, I think would tell you that it's never anything that you kind of finish learning. There's always that additional capacity to take on more and more and more. And that's kind of a requirement if you're going to be a good marketer. And so it kind of, one thing led to another as far as my career kind of progressed. And kind of I found myself just prior to Big Drop as an in-house marketer for different organizations, whether they were nonprofits, whether they were small businesses in various sectors as well. And once I kind of reached my stage before Big Drop, that's really where I got the understanding of how marketing really works in practice. It's really hard to be a good marketer, but do it exclusively from behind the scenes. You really need to be out there in front to really make sure that the marketing is landing, to make sure that the impact that you're aiming for is having the results that you want it to have. And from that, I kind of realized that I didn't want to work for just one organization. I wanted to work for all of them. And so that was where the agency life calling started. Big Drop was actually a prospect of mine at my former organization. And so when I went in to effectively pitch them, it was very clear that there was a alignment as far as where my next step was in my career and what they were looking for to augment their team. And I think through just a general work ethic that led to visibility within the organization, I now find myself running the day-to-day operation. So it's been an interesting ride. Yeah.
It definitely reminds me of a couple things. One, what you just mentioned about, Big Drop was a client and you end up going to work for them. And this was many, many years ago, and I was working in IT and finance for a multi-site insurance agency, and the vendor that we used for our automation system was in town to do some upgrades and whatnot. And just off the cuff, I asked them, if they were hiring, and they were in Chicago, and another, marketing and branding kind of city for sure.
Oh, sure.
So I, next thing you know, I'm on an airplane and they hired me and I worked there and made lifelong friends, and it really catapulted my career in a variety of different ways just by me asking a question and being open to it. So
Yeah.
that's definitely one thing. And two, this is something I've heard time and time again. Actually, individual that ran the publishing house that published a couple of my books, used to say, sales, and I don't know if it was originally his or not. It sounds more like a Dan Kennedy quote than anything, but it was, you know, you know, sales is serving and marketing is storytelling. And
Very much.
you said, about you got to be out there to see if it's landing. And it reminded me of during the pandemic when I was doing keynote talks, if and depending on how they set it up, you may or may not get to interact with the audience. So you're
Right.
literally talking at this camera and you have no idea if the jokes are landing or not. It's like, at a comedy club, you say something and no one says a thing, or you might
Immediate
get
feedback, immediate response, right?
yeah, and it's helpful. Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, of course, the ego gets a boost. That helps, but it's more of a, okay, is this message actually resonating with this audience? Are they going to do something with it, or at least be impacted by it, or have a
Right.
feeling about it? Or is it just me talking to this plastic camera lens and going, all right, here's this and this, and
Mhm.
away we go? So it's important to be out there. And as a former accountant, which was my original career, when I had to learn marketing, later on when I launched my business, it was there. I don't have regrets in life, but the one that I guess I would classify as a regret is I didn't pay more attention to marketing when I was in college, because I think it would have shortened the learning curve, because I had to basically deprogram myself from the finance brain and go, okay, time to get creative and
Right.
and understand what people are looking for.
Exactly. And you bring up a really interesting point too, because I think the thing that made my marketing better was having eventually at the role prior to Big Drop was having business development responsibilities within the marketing role. The way the organization was structured, the way that the value proposition was being communicated was business development and marketing were really, really hand in hand. You couldn't have one without the other. It was such a personal, it was effectively a business network. It was such a personal, narrative that we were telling that if you weren't in front of the, what we'll say, the member, then there was likely the case that the marketing wasn't reaching. And I think the thing that made my marketing more successful was understanding how to, quote unquote, sell. It's really the only benchmark to know. I mean, sure, we have certain, we have access to data, we have access to analytics, we can synthesize that, for hours and days, but being able to make that emotional connection, being able to make that physical connection with someone who is, effectively going to be a customer, that is the only true test of whether or not your marketing is landing. And I think understanding that sales mindset and applying that to the communications focus, that's where I found to be my marketing to be the most impactful. So I fully hear what you're saying. I agree.
Yeah, I think too, especially with social media, and I'm not going to pick on any particular platform, Instagram is, and I get it, they make money off of ad revenue. And I understand that. When people say, I don't like commercials, it's like, well, that's in a way how they're paying for the show to be produced for you. So understand that. It kind of softens the blow a little bit. But what I find time and time again is I will see ads and skim through them and or scroll past them, whatever the case may be, because a lot of them are just the same old
Right.
regurgitated everything out,
Formulated.
and yeah, and they feel canned. And even with AI, and this is one of those things where still in the pioneer days of that, but the
Right.
stuff that's being generated by AI, again, feels very generic, cookie cutter kind of things. And what I find, and there's a guy that I interviewed on my show several years ago who's out in Southern California, Stephen Morris, does some great work. What I find, like the work that he does is, and he does a lot of work in leadership, is authenticity. Being authentic, and we kind of hinted at that a little bit when we talked before about understanding, if it's landing or not. Each marketing campaign has to be unique and authentic. It can't be cookie cutter. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, and a lot of new entrepreneurs or young entrepreneurs are going at this approach to just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, instead of really narrowing down and figuring out, okay, who do I want to work with?
Right.
Who needs my services? So love to hear your thoughts on authentic marketing and why it's so critically important for people to focus more on that instead of just the broad-based, here's something for everybody which will serve nobody type of mentality.
Yeah, it's such an interesting concept because I have some feelings about the use of authenticity, and I do think to a certain degree, the more you can lean on something like core values, the more you can really bring that out of the brand, the better chance you have of establishing a connection with end user or a customer. But I think the appetite for any sort of campaign, it's tough because I think a lot of what we see, having worked in the past, has become the blueprint for what will be used in the future. And that's unfortunate because it really means that you do get into that cycle of, here's what we know has worked, let's just do more of it. But I think, customers, audience members, they have a pretty low barometer for inauthentic experiences. I think most people, especially now because digital is so democratized, we find that most users are not interested in being sold to. They want something more in that brand narrative. And when, in certain marketplaces where everything is very saturated, cutting through the noise to make sure that that connection happens is a real challenge. And if you're a brand who's doing the same things over and over again, that narrative will get lost. A lot of times when we're talking to clients about what they can do to establish a better connection, we're really talking about from what elements of the brand can we draw to help bring that story forward. And typically we're known in the website design and development space. That's been our core competency. Having, a digital property that is reflective fully of what the brand is aiming for, what their values are, how that needs to be communicated, how they're different, frankly, from the rest of their competitors. That's the unique challenge that I think our team has been able to address really, really well. And it really behooves brands, I think, to examine and evaluate what they're doing to help tell their own story. Leaning on an agency is a great way to do that because you get an objective opinion. But I think any agency that is not challenging the assumptions of a brand that they're working with isn't being a great partner. And so when we are thinking through what's the best way to tell the story, and sometimes it's a matter of tearing it down to build it back up. But all that legwork that's done in those initial stages, alongside things like, competitor research, market analysis, will help inform the perspective of what needs to happen when it comes to a campaign, when it comes to thinking through how that narrative needs to come across. And that's why it's baked into our formula. Our recipe for success always includes those elements.
It's critical. And I think of a couple personal examples of organizations I worked with that had worked with some external stakeholders more on a strategic planning situation, but very similar. And they did the same thing because when they did the initial survey of the employees and the board of directors, the consultants would come back and say, based on our survey results, even though you are one company, based on what everybody thinks the mission, vision, and values of the organizations are, you have about 20 companies here. So that was their backhanded compliment to say, you guys aren't all on the same page. So let's scale this back. And then, another organization, I remember it was a strat planning session with the board of directors, and they're going about all this, and we should do this, and we should do this. And then finally, one of the board members And yeah, I remember this because he was sitting across from me. All of a sudden, he stood up and he basically said, enough. And he usually wasn't that bold in the meeting. He said, I have one question for everybody. Who are we? And that was one of those, okay, let's get back to the core values of actually who we are.
100%.
And when we left that meeting, everyone was in unison, at least at that point in time,
Yeah.
of who we were as an organization, what our mission was, why we were founded, all of those things, because that kind of just, it was like broken telephone for people that remember that phrase. Just like you tell somebody, and by the time it makes it around the room, it gets back to you, and the story's completely changed.
Right.
And it was the same thing with the board. It was like, yeah, we started off as this, now we think we're this. It's like, no, that's not who we are. We're this. So it boils down to communication, understanding, and getting everyone on the same page. It doesn't mean we don't like a variety of ideas. That's how businesses grow. That's how they expand offerings, is by listening to their customers, figuring out, okay, is this
Right.
a market, or is this, too far off in left field, which, growing up in Detroit, General Motors used to be really famous for that. It's like, okay,
Sure.
we're making cars. Okay, now we're doing satellite dishes, and we're going to get into banking, and we're going to do this. And GM lost their way, and Toyota went, oh, while you guys are messing around with that, we're going to pass you and become the number one automaker because we make cars. And not to smack GM, because they employed my dad and my grandfather and my great grandfather, so I could say that I
There's
shouldn't
legacy there.
smack it. Yeah, I didn't work there, and that was by choice and a strong recommendation from my father. He says, you're probably going to want to go into a different industry. Now, I don't know if he was saying that because he saw the writing on the wall, or he knew that I had no mechanical skills to save my life. So 6 of one, half dozen of the other, probably.
Yeah.
But again, it boils down to just really getting an understanding, and the way you approach it is where you're going to have the most success.
Yeah.
Because if you go in and say, okay, we're going to be your new marketing consulting agency, and we're going to market, and we're saying, okay, this is what we want to market. And you're going to go, okay, copy, paste, send it out. It goes, boop. And then they're like, why didn't it work? And it's because we didn't dig into what it was in the first place, because, clarity attracts, confusion repels. And unless your marketing is crystal clear, it's going to repel people. They're going to go, I don't know what that is. They're going to move on from it.
Yeah. And I think the opacity that comes from that really frustrates customers and users to the point where, it's a complete conversion killer, no matter what it is that you're trying to sell or trying to break through. But you've touched on quite a few things that I think are really interesting. I think one of the things that we find to be the most successful starting points for engagements with our team is really making sure that there's complete alignment across stakeholders, internally and externally. If we can't agree on the core principles that are going to drive whatever it is that we're doing, whether we're building a brand new site, a mobile application, we're starting a digital marketing campaign, anything like that, we don't want to be derailed at the onset. We try to take our time to make sure that everything that we're planning for has, the proverbial sign off from everyone, that everyone understands what the goals are, how we're going to get there, and what it is that we need to do to achieve that. And I think that, coupled with the fact that, we're, especially at Big Drop, we are never fans of a one size fits all approach. It doesn't work. It doesn't give the value that a brand or a company is looking for, especially from, a party like ours, partner like ours. And because our process is focused mainly on kind of the tailored approach to getting from point A to point B, that is the key driver of the success that we've been able to find within all the engagements really that have come through Big Drop's doors. We are not going to offer a cookie cutter solution, because what may work for one industry, one set of objectives for a certain engagement is not necessarily going to work for the other. If we can get to the core of what it is that we're doing and apply a unique approach to that on behalf of the client with their consent, we know that we've done our job well. And it's this goes back to the first point that you brought up, that kind of cookie cutter, kind of move it along, use the same formula over and over again. It doesn't work for a reason. And we understand that. And I think any marketer, again, back to our initial conversation, any marketer worth their salt would want to find ways to top and tailor things to make them as customized as possible, because that's the only way you're really going to make that connection.
It ties into, the being authentic and being who you are and who are we. And you need your branding, all your marketing, who you talk to, how you present yourself, everything has to be in sync, because if it's not, then it can confuse people. Like, they seem to be a little disjointed there. And of course that's going to raise red flags. And, there's no shortage of opportunities to work with a variety of different organizations, but there's only a handful that are, like we call the top 2%, that are, really, really on the game. Obviously Big Drop is in that 2% change or arena, because you actually take the time to do the work. It's not okay, well, let's, rush these through and get these out. I mean, yeah, there's, time crunches that the client puts on you,
For sure.
and which is always entertaining. It's like, yeah, I need this done. When? Tomorrow.
Right. My favorite answer to that is yesterday. It's like, well,
yeah, oh yeah, that's pretty much it. They go yesterday. It's like, okay, so we have, there's we got quite a backlog of people releasing yesterday. How about 2 weeks from Friday? Let's look at that first. Let's kind of get an idea. And I get that, and it's just human nature. I worked in healthcare, so I know when people go to the doctors long after they needed to, and it's just we procrastinate. It's one commonality in this ever divisive world. We're all procrastinating about something. And I think that, the key point for people to remember is get ahead of it, and start, thinking about it even before it's designed, because, this is something we don't hear a lot about, but it's really critical. Is I think when you're having the conversations about how to market a product or service, if it's not fully flushed out, those conversations can actually bring some light to, maybe we should change the product or service to actually do this. So these conversations are more than just, hey, well, we're going to market this and this is where the campaign's going to be and who we're going to target.
100%.
It can help with design too. And I don't think enough people realize that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, a lot of times when we're creating any sort of creative, whether it is for a campaign or if it's really around a brand, one of the biggest things that we look at is the data. The data will inform your perspective on, what you need to do to bridge that gap. And it may be the case where the data is telling you one thing, but your assumptions about the business are saying another. Reconciling that is always a unique challenge. It's always a fun challenge too. I think if we're able to provide some sort of evidentiary support that says we need to move in this direction, I don't think a client would ever really be upset with that. But it does give you the tools to think through what the next steps are going to be. How will the mission, the value proposition, how will that evolve? What is needed on our side from a design perspective to help that happen? And I think most of the clients that come to us have that same kind of dilemma. We're in a different spot than we were before, and our presence isn't cutting it. We're not the same company that we have been. This is how we've changed, and we need something to reflect that. That's a common conversation for us in almost every initial conversation. And of course, the fun starts when it becomes, okay, now how do we get there, right? You've been doing X for so long, we can see it with Y, and this is how. And that's pretty much the ethos that runs through every sort of engagement at Big Drop and across all of our core services. Of course, it's reflected most, I think, in the branding and the website design. But once we get to building a presence that's going to function well, that's going to communicate properly, then it's really about how do we drive traffic to it, and doing that in a way that still is tied from the initial set of principles that lay the foundation for the digital presence to be built. All of that is really kind of how we move the needle forward for a client.
Yeah, it's amazing work that you're doing, and congratulations on the early success, and you're going to keep thriving on this. So, James, love this conversation. Where can people find out more about you and Big Drop and all the amazing stuff you're doing?
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for this. You can find us at bigdropinc.com. Check out our portfolio because I think you'll be really impressed. But our team does some excellent work, so I'm really proud to highlight that. I'm on LinkedIn, James Alexander Weiss. You can find us on social channels as well. But yeah, thank you for having me. This is great.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you. And I'll definitely have all that information in the show notes. So continued success, James. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michael. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to the Breakfast Leadership Show, part of the Breakfast Leadership Network. Visit breakfastleadership.com for tips on empowering your business and your life.